The window faced east. Every morning the sun would rise through it, slicing soft beams of light across the wooden floor, illuminating the same stretch of dust, the same curve of the old rocking chair, the same empty space where nothing ever changed. My name is Helen Barrett. I'm 87 years old, and I've been sitting at that window waiting for 20 years. They told me to stop. My daughter Julia would bring me soup or tea and gently suggest that I try the other chair, the one in the den with the view of the backyard. The nurses who visited weekly would make notes about my posture, my blood pressure, and always ask if I was still watching the street. "It's not healthy, Helen," they'd say, but they didn't understand. It wasn't about the street. It wasn't even about the window. It was about the space just beyond it, where I last saw my son. His name was Michael. He was 27 the day he walked out. He had on his brown corduroy jacket, the one with the loose seam at the shoulder, and he carried a duffel bag slung carelessly over one shoulder. His jaw was clenched. His eyes, so much like his father's, were filled with something I didn't recognize until much later. Fear masked as anger. We had argued over what I couldn't even tell you now. Something petty, something important, something that should never have made a boy walk away from his mother. But he did. He crossed the street, didn't look back, and then he disappeared. For weeks, I expected a phone call. For months, I left his room untouched. For years, I wrote letters I never sent. And then I just watched. The window became my confession booth, my sanctuary, my punishment. I told myself, if he ever came back, I wanted him to see me, to know I never gave up. That I waited. People talked. At first, neighbors would ask gently if I'd heard anything. Then they stopped asking. The pity faded into polite nods, and eventually I became something else. A fixture. The old woman at the window. Some children whispered stories about me, that I was a ghost, that I had died long ago and no one had noticed. But I was very much alive. Alive enough to count every season by the tree across the street, how it bloomed in the spring, how it withered in fall. Alive enough to recognize the shifting traffic patterns, the new mailman, the dog that always barked at 4:17 p.m. Alive enough to remember the last time my son said my name. You learn a lot sitting by a window. You learn how people change, how they come and go, how the world moves on without you if you let it. But you also learn that stillness has its own kind of power. There's grace in staying, even when everyone else tells you to move on, especially then. One morning, a little boy stopped on the sidewalk. He couldn't have been more than 6. He had a red balloon tied to his wrist and a scuffed backpack. He looked up at my window and waved. I blinked, and I waved back. The next day, he did it again, and again. For a week, we had our silent ritual. He'd pass, wave, and I'd raise my hand in return. Then one morning, he wasn't there. And I realized with a pang so sudden it stole my breath that I had been waiting for him too. That somewhere along the line, I had started watching for more than just Michael. I was watching for proof that I was still here, that I still mattered. The frame of the window began to rot years ago. I could have had it replaced, Julia offered. She even brought over paint samples, tried to convince me that a splash of color would brighten the room, but I refused. Because that worn-out frame, it held more than glass. It held my story. It held 20 years of waiting, of hoping, of becoming something more than a woman left behind. It became the place where I found a strange kind of faith, not in certainty, but in endurance. Because every morning I sat down, pulled the blanket over my knees, watched the sun stretch its fingers across the street, and whispered the same words. Come home, Michael, just come home. I never said them aloud, but I didn't have to. because I believed that somehow he'd hear them. And maybe, just maybe, the wind would carry them far enough. Far enough to reach the boy who walked away. Far enough to bring him back. The second week after Michael left, I wrote the first letter. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where we'd once eaten Sunday dinners and folded laundry together, and I wrote like my life depended on it. Because in some ways it did. My hands shook as I held the pen. Not because of age. I wasn't old back then. Not yet. I was 67, still walking to the market on Tuesdays, still gardening when the sun allowed it. But that morning, my fingers trembled because I didn't know how to put into words what silence had already begun to swallow. The letter was 3 pages long. I started with Dear Michael because my sweet boy felt like too much, and son felt like not enough. I told him I was sorry, not just for the argument, but for all the things that came before it. For the years I didn't listen the way I should have. For the moments I thought I was helping when I was only hurting. I told him I loved him, not in a loud movie kind of way, but in the way I washed his socks and sat through his favorite TV shows even when I didn't understand them. I told him I forgave him, even though a part of me still didn't know what exactly I was forgiving. I mailed it the next day. It came back a week later. Return to sender. Address unknown. My knees buckled when I pulled it from the mailbox. I remember the way the edges of the envelope were smudged, as if it had been handled by too many hands and still reached no one. I didn't cry. I just sat on the porch for a long time, and then I wrote another one. Over the years, I wrote more than 200 letters. Some were long and rambling. Others were brief, 2 sentences, sometimes just one. I made your favorite soup today. Or, the dog down the street had puppies. Remember how you used to name them? I never sent them again. I kept them in a wooden box under my bed. Because after that first return, I realized it wasn't about him receiving them. It was about me needing to say the words. To someone. To anyone. Even if it was just the paper. Every month I reread a few. I sorted them by season, by emotion. There were spring letters, hopeful, full of renewal. Summer letters, warm and nostalgic, scented with the memory of honeysuckle and thunderstorms. Autumn letters, aching, slow as leaves outside mirrored the letting go inside me. And winter letters, short, stark, filled with longing. I began to know myself through those letters. They became a mirror, not to who I was, but to who I had become. A woman defined not by age or circumstance or the label of mother, but by the act of waiting. Sometimes I imagine that Michael was reading them, that maybe somewhere far away he had a box too, that by some miracle a letter had found its way to him, and he kept it like a secret flame. I pictured him sitting at a table like mine, older now, maybe grayer, reading my words and hearing my voice. I pictured him crying. I pictured him smiling. I pictured him coming home. I told no one about the letters, not even Julia. She would have told me it was time to move on, to throw them out, to stop writing to someone who might never read a word. But mothers do strange things when their children vanish. We keep toothbrushes. We remember shoe sizes. We whisper their names into the steam of a boiling pot, into the crease of a pillow, into the dust that settles on picture frames. We write letters no one answers. A year after Michael left, I began reading them aloud, not loudly, not performatively, just quietly to myself. I'd pick one, unfold it, and speak the words into the stillness of the room. I told myself the walls were listening, that the house which had watched him grow would carry my voice to wherever he was. I imagined the wind slipping through the cracks, picking up my words, flying them across oceans if it had to. Grief teaches you to believe in small magics. It has to. Otherwise, you stop breathing. One day, a nurse named Clara found a letter I had left accidentally on the kitchen counter. She picked it up, read a few lines before she realized what it was. "This is beautiful," she said, her voice hushed. "It's not for you," I snapped. She nodded, gently placing it back down. "No," she said, "but maybe it's for the world." I didn't answer her, but later that night, I thought about what she said. Maybe the letters weren't just for Michael. Maybe they were for every mother who had lost something they never got back. Maybe they were for me. The letter he never answered was only the first. The rest built a bridge, not to him, but to the parts of myself I'd buried beneath guilt and silence. They reminded me that love doesn't vanish in absence. It transforms. It reshapes. It finds a way to bloom in the cracks left behind. I never stopped writing. Even when my hands stiffened and my eyes blurred. Even when the world moved on. Because hope isn't something you hold. It's something you write. And I wrote. Every day. When Michael first disappeared, people came. They knocked. They called. They brought casseroles wrapped in foil and jars of soup and fresh bread I didn't ask for. They sat on my couch and held my hand. They said things like, "He'll be back." These things happen. You just have to give him time. Time. It was the one thing everyone offered like it was free, but they didn't realize what it cost. Because when you're waiting, time isn't soft, it's not gentle, it sharpens. It scrapes the inside of your chest until every breath is a memory you're not ready to relive. The first to stop coming was Betty Lawson. She had been my neighbor for over 20 years, the kind who borrowed sugar and never returned the Tupperware, the kind who liked to know just enough about your life to retell it at her bridge club. Betty came 3 times, brought scones the first time, a tulip bulb the second, silence the third. She didn't come after that. Then came the church folks. I had been part of the choir once. Michael used to play piano there on Sundays. After he left, the visits came less often. Pastor Grayson came by with his Bible and warm eyes. "He's out there," he told me. "The Lord watches over him." I nodded, not because I believed him, but because I wanted to. He came 4 times, then stopped. By the end of the first year, only Julia came, and she didn't come to talk about Michael. She came to clean, to replace things that didn't need replacing, to tell me how the grandkids were doing, to suggest I come stay with her, but I never left. I couldn't, because what if that was the day? What if the one day I left was the day he came back? The window became more than a habit, it became a boundary, not to keep the world out, but to keep my hope in. I watched everything from that frame. The Morgan's twins growing from strollers to skateboards. The empty house across the street cycling through renters. The seasons painting the trees in their palette of endings and beginnings. I memorized the postman's name. I learned the routines of the neighborhood dogs. I even knew when the mail carrier was new, not by the uniform, but by the way they glanced at me in the window. The veterans never looked anymore. Children started to notice me in different ways. At first they were curious, then they were cautious, then cruel. I became a story they told one another, a ghost, a witch, the woman who never moved. Some left notes on the porch, mocking, scribbled in crayon. One said, "Are you dead?" I kept that one, taped it inside my box of letters, because even mockery is a form of attention, and attention means you still exist. But the ones that hurt the most were the kind glances that faded, the smiles that stopped, the way someone who used to wave now crossed the street a few steps early. I understood. Grief makes people uncomfortable. Long grief, that makes them forget you entirely. So I made peace with it. I stopped expecting visitors, stopped opening the door when they rang just once. I only moved when it was Julia. She had her own key. I became part of the house, like the old wallpaper, like the creak in the floorboards, like the window itself. But something strange happens when you disappear in plain sight. You start to see the world differently. You learn how to read silence, how to hear the words people don't say. You begin to understand that loneliness isn't the absence of people, it's the presence of pain they don't want to acknowledge. One day, years after the visits had stopped, a young woman moved into the apartment above the bakery across the street. She was in her early 20s, bright red coat, headphones always around her neck. For 3 days, she never looked at my window. On the 4th, she did. She held my gaze and smiled. Not politely, not curiously, genuinely, like she saw me. It nearly undid me. I didn't smile back. Not right away, but the next day I did. A week later, she left a package on my doorstep. No note, just a book of poetry and a thermos of tea. I never learned her name, but I kept the book. And every time I felt the loneliness wrap itself too tightly around me, I opened to the first page, where she had written in careful script, "I see you, and I believe you're still waiting for something beautiful." The neighbors may have stopped asking, but someone else had noticed. And sometimes that was enough. It was a Tuesday. I remember that clearly, though I can't tell you the exact date or year anymore. But I remember it was Tuesday because the garbage trucks had come by in the morning, their mechanical arms screeching like always, startling the birds from the wires. I remember Julia had called around lunchtime. I don't remember what she said, only that she sounded distracted. I remember the wind was fierce that afternoon, rattling the window glass in its frame like it wanted to be let in. And I remember standing by the window, holding the curtain in my hand, ready, finally, to close it. I hadn't intended it. I didn't wake up that morning and say, "Today is the day I stop." But something in me had shifted. Maybe it was the ache in my knees from sitting too long. Maybe it was the sight of the tree outside, now bare and brittle, stripped of every last leaf. Maybe it was the mailbox, empty again. Maybe it was nothing in particular and everything all at once. But that day I couldn't bear to look out anymore. Because there's something cruel about windows, you know. They let you see the world, but not touch it. They let you hope, but not hold. They frame everything you've lost in crisp, sharp borders. I stood with the curtain in my hand for nearly an hour. I don't think I moved. I remember thinking how strange it was, that something as thin as a piece of fabric could feel like a wall, like a choice. If I closed it, I knew it would mean something. Not just giving up on Michael, but giving up on the idea of him ever wanting to return. Giving up on being the mother who waited. Becoming just an old woman in an old chair. My hand shook. Not from weakness, but from fear. Because what if closing the curtain wasn't a failure? What if it was freedom? What if the very thing that had sustained me, this ritual, this vigil, had also become my prison? What if I had built my life around a ghost? And what if I had to let him go, not because he was dead, but because I needed to live? I took a breath and began to pull the curtain across the window. Slowly, the light dimmed, the frame disappeared. The world outside blurred into fabric and shadow. And then, a knock. Not on the door, not on the wall, but on the glass. I froze, turned. No one was there. Just the wind, just the same street, just the same silence. But I heard it. I know I did. And I don't believe in ghosts. But that moment felt like something more than coincidence. It felt like a heartbeat, a reminder, a whisper, not yet. I let the curtain fall back. Didn't close it. Didn't open it fully either. Just left it halfway drawn. Enough to see out. Enough to hope. Not because I was strong, but because I wasn't ready to be anything else. Because I realized that even if the waiting never ended, the act of waiting was, in itself, a kind of love. And love doesn't always need a resolution. Sometimes it just needs a window. I made tea after that, wrote another letter. I didn't mention the curtain, didn't mention the knock. I simply wrote, I almost gave up today, but I didn't. I thought of your eyes. I thought of how they looked the day you were born. You didn't cry right away. Just looked around the room like you already understood it all. I think of that every time I'm about to close the curtain. I don't know if I'll ever close it, but that day taught me something I didn't expect. That we don't always need signs. Sometimes we just need a reason to pause, to breathe, to listen for a knock that might not come, and to keep the light on anyway. His name was Daniel, but I didn't know that at first. When I first saw him, he was just the boy across the street, the one with the too big backpack and the scuffed sneakers that always came untied. He must have been 7 or 8 when his family moved into the old Carrington house. A young couple with twin daughters and a boy who didn't smile much. They brought with them noise and life, something that house hadn't seen in years. The father grilled on Sundays and the mother planted marigolds. But it was the boy who caught my eye, because he noticed me. At first, it was just glances. He'd look up as he walked to school, eyes darting toward my window like he was checking to see if I was still there. I always was. Then came the wave. A small one, almost shy. Just a flick of fingers raised in my direction. I didn't wave back. Not because I didn't want to, but because something about that small act, so innocent, so unburdened, threatened to undo the stillness I'd spent years building. But the next day he waved again. And the day after that, until finally I lifted my hand in return. That became our silent agreement. A wave each morning, a wave each afternoon. Nothing more. But somehow it became everything. I started looking for him, not just at the window, in the rhythm of my days. If he was late, I noticed. If he was laughing, I smiled. If he looked tired, I worried. He didn't know any of this, of course. He just kept waving. One rainy morning, he stopped. He stood on the sidewalk, drenched, holding his backpack over his head, staring up at my window. I stood. I raised my hand. He waved, then ran to school, his shoes splashing through puddles. Later that day, I found something on my doorstep, a drawing, crayon on construction paper. It showed a house, a tree, a boy with wild brown hair, and a window. Inside the window, a woman, me. Below it, in big shaky letters, it said, "Hello, lady who waves." I cried, not because it was sweet, but because it was the first time in years someone had seen me as something other than a shadow in a chair. I taped the drawing to the inside of the window, and the next morning, when he passed, he beamed. Weeks passed, seasons shifted. Daniel grew taller. He started wearing headphones. His waves became nods, but he never stopped looking. Even when his backpack changed, even when he traded crayons for textbooks, he always glanced up. I began to imagine that maybe in some small way he understood, that he saw the waiting, that he felt the quiet, that he knew my story even if I never told him. One afternoon, Julia came by. She saw the drawing in the window. "What's this?" she asked. I told her about the boy. She smiled. "It's nice that someone's keeping you company." I wanted to say he wasn't just company. He was proof that I wasn't invisible, that I was still part of the world, that even in silence, connection finds its way through the cracks. The real change came the day he knocked on my door. He was older then, maybe 15, taller. His voice had changed, but his eyes were the same. "Hi," he said, holding a book in his hands. "I hope this isn't weird." I blinked. "What is it?" He handed me the book. "It's my favorite. We're reading it in school. I thought maybe you'd like it too." It was a collection of short stories. Inside the cover, he'd written, For the lady in the window who never stopped looking, I invited him in. He didn't stay long. But in that brief visit, he told me about school, his sisters, how he liked history and hated math. He asked me what I liked to read, and I showed him my shelf of worn paperbacks. When he left, he said, "I always wondered what you were thinking about. You looked like someone who knew things." I smiled. "I've had a lot of time to think." He nodded. "Maybe one day you'll tell me." After that, he came by more often, sometimes just to wave, sometimes to talk, sometimes to sit quietly while we read. And little by little, without meaning to, Daniel became something I hadn't known I needed. A witness, someone to share the waiting with. He never asked about Michael, but I think he knew. And that was enough. It wasn't much to look at. Old wood, darkened with time and touched by sun. The backrest had a slight crack running through it, just enough to give a soft creak when someone leaned too far. The cushion, once a vibrant floral pattern, had faded into muted pastels, the kind that could blend into wallpaper or memories. It sat by the window, always. It had belonged to my mother, then me, and now it belonged to time. I never planned to make it my place of waiting. In the early years after Michael left, I tried other chairs. I moved around the house like a restless ghost. The sofa, the rocker in the den, the bench in the garden. But none of them felt right. They were too soft, too far, too unfamiliar. The chair by the window was different. It wasn't comfortable, not in the physical sense, but it held me. Not just my body, but my weight. The weight of waiting, of wondering, of holding on to something that might never return. And so I sat, day after day, season after season. The chair never complained. It became part of the view. Neighbors came and went. Cars changed. Children grew. But the chair and the woman inside it remained. At first, I resisted the identity. I didn't want to be defined by stillness. But eventually, I came to understand that the act of sitting, deliberate, present, patient, was not weakness. It was strength. It was faith. The chair became my anchor, my confession booth, my companion, and in some strange way, it became a symbol. Daniel noticed the chair before he noticed me. He told me once during one of his visits, I thought it was magic, like maybe the house was alive and the chair was its heart. I laughed. He wasn't wrong, because from that chair, I had lived 1,000 lives, not in action, but in thought, in memory, in watching, in loving from afar. The cushion had flattened years ago. Julia offered to replace it, brought catalogs, swatches, talked about lumbar support and better fabric. I told her no, not because I didn't want comfort, but because the discomfort was part of the ritual, part of the promise, that no matter how long it took, I would remain, even if it hurt, especially if it hurt. When Daniel started visiting regularly, he asked if I ever left the chair. Of course, and I told him, I eat, I sleep, I water the plants, but the chair is where I come back to. He nodded, thoughtful. Like church, he said. I smiled. Exactly. One day, he brought a small wooden stool. He placed it beside the chair and sat. We didn't talk much that afternoon, just sat. Side by side, two figures in two seats, facing the world through the same pane of glass. He returned the next day, and the next. Soon, the stool became a fixture too, not as weathered, not as storied, but present, like him. I started to see the chair differently then, not as a symbol of loneliness, but of endurance, of resilience, of love that doesn't move just because the world tells it to. Sometimes I imagined Michael sitting in it. I'd close my eyes and picture his younger self, feet swinging, book in hand. Then older, face tired, jacket slung over the back. Then older still, gray at the temples, eyes softened by time. In every version, he looked at me and smiled. I knew you'd still be here, he'd say. And I'd reply, I never had a reason to leave. One evening, Daniel asked if he could take a photo of the chair. For a school project, he explained. It's about things that stay. I nodded. He took the picture. Then he sat again. And after a long silence, he said, I think this chair has waited for more than just your son. I looked at him. He was right. The chair had waited for me too. For me to come to terms. For me to let go of guilt. For me to learn that waiting doesn't mean you're stuck. Sometimes it just means you're faithful. It was a Thursday afternoon and the sky had just begun to shift from blue to silver, the kind of light that made everything look softer, quieter, like the world itself was holding its breath. I was sitting in the chair, as always, watching the breeze bend the trees in slow, graceful arcs. Daniel had just left 20 minutes before, leaving behind a book he thought I'd like. I hadn't opened it yet. I was thinking of Michael, not the missing Michael, not the shadow I'd carried for 20 years, but the little boy who once built forts in the living room, who snuck cookies before dinner, who used to fall asleep with one hand clutching his stuffed dinosaur. I was picturing that Michael when the doorbell rang. It startled me. Few people rang anymore. Most knew to knock or just let themselves in. Julia, Daniel, the nurse who came once a week. But this was a ring, a firm 2-second press, intentional. I waited, then rose slowly, legs stiff from sitting. I opened the door, not expecting anything except perhaps a delivery driver who got the address wrong. But instead, I found a woman standing there, mid-30s maybe, hair pulled into a braid, eyes a soft brown rimmed with uncertainty. She held something in her hands, a folded piece of paper, and she looked at me the way someone might look at a portrait they'd seen in a storybook. Familiar, yet strange. Mrs. Barrett, she asked him. I nodded slowly. She exhaled, her shoulders loosening. I'm sorry to just show up. I didn't know if you'd still be here. Still be here. I had never left. She introduced herself as Rachel. I'm not sure how to begin, she said. So I invited her in. She sat on the couch holding the paper in her lap like it weighed too much to carry. I made tea because making tea is what you do when something big is about to happen, and you need your hands to feel useful. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, I knew your son. The words didn't hit all at once. They dropped slowly, one after the other, like stones into a deep well. I blinked. She unfolded the paper. It was a photograph of Michael. Older, bearded, smiling, holding a baby in his arms. I met him in Arizona, she said, about 15 years ago. He was working at a bookstore I went to often. We became friends, close friends. She paused. I didn't know he had family. He never spoke of it. Not until the end. The end. My chest tightened. She nodded. He passed away 2 years ago, pancreatic cancer. It was quick. I hadn't realized I was gripping the edge of the chair and until she reached out and touched my hand. I'm so sorry. I looked at the photograph. My boy, gone, and yet here, smiling in a life I never knew he had. He told me about you, she continued. At the end, he said he didn't know if you'd forgive him, that he was scared to reach out, that too much time had passed. My throat burned. She handed me an envelope. He wrote this, asked me to give it to you. I didn't know where to find you at first. I wasn't sure if I ever would. My fingers trembled as I took it. It was sealed. My name written in his hand, slanted, familiar. I didn't open it. Not yet. I held it to my chest and cried. Rachel stayed for over an hour. She told me about his life, how he loved poetry, how he ran writing workshops at the library, how he adopted a dog named Daisy, how he made pancakes every Sunday, how he had a daughter, my granddaughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 13 now. Loved astronomy and hated math. Had his smile, his laugh. Rachel showed me pictures. Birthdays, vacations, school plays. A life. A whole, full, beautiful life. Without me. But somehow in the end, circling back. When Rachel left, she hugged me. Tightly. Like she was giving me a piece of him. She promised to write. To send more pictures. To bring Sophie to visit if I wanted. I nodded. I wanted. So much. That night, I sat in the chair with the letter in my lap. The house was quiet. The window glowed softly with the street light outside. I opened it. It began simply. Dear Mom, I don't know if this will reach you, but if it does, I want you to know that I thought of you often, more than you probably imagine. I was angry when I left, but it wasn't you I was angry at. Not really. It was myself, the world, my own fear. I missed you every day. I kept trying to find the courage to call, to write. I got close, then I didn't. I told myself too much time had passed. But time is funny. Because even now, after all these years, I still see your face at the window. Still wonder if you're there. If you are, thank you for waiting. Thank you for believing. I love you. Always. Michael, I didn't sleep that night. I just sat with the letter, with the photo, with the knowing that I had not waited in vain. The chair held me as always. The silence no longer felt empty because love had returned. Maybe not in the way I dreamed, but in the way I needed. The day after Rachel left, the house felt different. Not louder, not busier, but fuller somehow. As though every room, every wall, every floorboard had absorbed her voice and Michael's name and was now holding it gently, like a secret too precious to forget. I moved slowly that morning, teacup in hand, fingers brushing across furniture I hadn't really looked at in years. The letter sat on the mantel now, framed in a way that would have made Michael roll his eyes. But I didn't care. It belonged in the open. It had waited long enough. I stood at the window as always, letting the light spill across my hands. But today, the waiting felt different because I was no longer waiting to be found. I had been. That afternoon, I went searching for something I hadn't dared to look at in decades. The old drawer, bottom one, far left of the hallway cabinet, stuck from humidity and time. I hadn't opened it since the year Michael left. Not because I forgot it was there, but because I remembered too well. Inside a box, blue velvet frayed at the corners. I sat on the floor and opened it. Photos, dozens of them. Some black and white, some Polaroid, some curled at the edges, all thick with dust and memory. There he was, Michael at 5, grinning beside a snowman. Michael at 12, proudly holding a science fair ribbon. Michael at 17 in his high school graduation robe. That hesitant smile that always meant he wasn't sure what came next. And at the bottom, a photo I had nearly forgotten existed. Michael and me. In the garden. I was kneeling in the dirt, hands covered in soil. He stood beside me, holding a watering can, pretending to pour it over my head. We were both laughing. His eyes were squinted from the sun, mine from joy. I had hidden it because it hurt too much. Because after he left, every happy image became a reminder of the silence that followed. But now as I held it, I didn't feel pain. I felt warmth, as though the photo had waited too, just like me. Waited to be seen again. To remind me that love isn't erased by time, it's preserved by memory. And sometimes hidden things carry the loudest truths. I placed the photo on the side table next to his letter. And that evening when Daniel came by, I showed it to him. "This is him?" he asked softly. I nodded. "You look happy." I was. "Are you now?" It was a fair question. I thought for a moment. Yes, I said, in a way I didn't think was possible. He studied the photo. He looks like you. He was always more like his father, I said, but maybe that's why he came back through a letter. His father always believed in writing things down. Daniel smiled. Do you think he knew you'd keep waiting? I think he hoped I would, I said. But maybe more than that, I think he needed to believe someone would still be there, just in case. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from grief, but from something else. Something that felt like beginning. I rose and walked the house like I used to years ago. Took out more photos. Lined them along the dining table. Each one a piece of the puzzle I'd stopped trying to solve. Each one a little spark of who I was when he was here. And who I still am, now that I know he never truly left. The next day I wrote a letter. To Sophie, I had to introduce myself not as someone lost to time, but as someone who had never stopped loving the part of her that belonged to Michael. Dear Sophie, I've waited 20 years to write this letter, even though I didn't know your name until yesterday. Your father was my son. You may have never heard of me, but I have held space for you in my heart from the moment he left. There is so much I'd love to share. About him, about who he was before the bookstore and the dom and the pancakes on Sundays. But most of all, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are not a final chapter. You are a continuation, and I am here. If you want me to be, I sealed it with trembling hands. Gave it to Rachel the next time she visited. She smiled. She'll love this, she said. She already has questions. And now, she'll have someone to ask. I watched her walk down the path, letter in hand. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something lift. A weight, a sadness, an old fear. And in its place, something new began to bloom. That evening, I returned to the photo, held it to my chest, and whispered to was subtle, not loud, not demanding. Just a soft tap tap, like a question made of breath and wood and time. At first, I thought it was the wind. The glass had always creaked and moaned in the breeze. After all, it was older than most things in the house. But this sound wasn't from the wind. It had rhythm, intent, a human kind of pause between each knock. I turned slowly. And there, just beyond the frosted pane of my living room window, stood a girl. She had long dark hair, a blue scarf wrapped twice around her neck, and mittens the color of winter berries. She was taller than I imagined, older than I'd pictured, but even from behind the glass I could tell it was her, Sophie, my granddaughter. I didn't move at first. For a moment my body forgot how. Then she lifted her mittened hand and waved. I waved back. And in that simple motion, 20 years folded in on themselves. I opened the door before she could knock again. Rachel stood beside her, smiling. She didn't say anything, just reached out and placed a hand on my arm. I understood. Words weren't needed. Sophie looked nervous, shy, hopeful. Hi, she said. Hi, I replied. And then, like she'd done it 1,000 times before, she stepped forward and hugged me. I didn't know how long we stood there, but it felt like time stopped again, not in grief or waiting, but in something sacred. When we finally pulled apart, she looked up at me and said, I read your letter. Did you like it? I asked. She nodded. It made me cry, but also, I don't know, safe? That word, safe. I hadn't realized how long I'd waited to hear something like that. To know that in some small way, after all the years of uncertainty, I had become a place someone could return to. We went inside. I made tea. She asked questions. I told stories. Some of them were hard, about Michael's childhood, about the day he left, about the ache that followed. Some were joyful, about his laugh, his love of cherry pie, the time he tried to build a tree house and fell out before it was even finished. She listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. It's a rare gift, and she had it. When the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor, Sophie walked to the window. She stood in front of my chair. "Can I sit?" she asked. It startled me. No one had ever asked that before. "Of course," I said. She lowered herself into it slowly, ran her hand along the worn armrest, looked out through the glass. "It feels like it remembers things," she said. "It does," I whispered. She didn't stay long. Rachel had work in the morning. But before they left, Sophie turned to me and said, "Can I come back?" I laughed. "As often as you want." And then she said something I will never forget. "I think you waited for me too, not just for him." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was too full. That night, I didn't sit in the chair. I let it rest. For the first time in decades, it didn't feel like mine alone anymore. It belonged to her now too. To anyone who needed it. To anyone who had waited too long to be seen. I sat on the couch instead and watched the window. And waited, not in grief, but in gratitude, because a knock had come. And it had opened more than a door. It had opened a future. The next morning, I found a note tucked under the front doormat. It was written in pencil, a little messy, a little unsure. It said, "Dear Grandma, I'll come again Friday. I'll bring my telescope. Maybe we can look at the stars together. Love, Sophie." I held it to my chest. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt something beautiful rise inside me. Not just hope, not just love, but belonging and joy. It happened on a Sunday. Not the closing itself, but the decision. There was sunlight streaming through the curtains, warming the carpet. The kettle on the stove hummed softly. Outside, birds chirped in that lazy way they do when the morning doesn't demand anything urgent. I stood at the window as I had done every morning for over 2 decades. But this time, something inside me was different. I wasn't waiting. Not anymore. I was simply looking. Sophie had visited 3 times that week. She brought her telescope, just as she had promised. We sat outside in the chilly dusk, bundled in blankets, sipping cocoa and naming stars. She told me about school, about friends, about a boy she liked who didn't know she existed. And I told her about the garden I once kept, the summer Michael broke his arm climbing the apple tree, the secret place in the attic where he'd hide when the world felt too big. We were building something new. That Sunday, she came with a box. It was a gift, a photo album. Inside were pictures of Michael, some from Rachel, some from Sophie's phone, scanned and printed. And then near the back were pictures of me. Not ones I'd taken, not even ones I remembered anyone else taking. Me in the chair, me in the garden, me at the window. Each image labeled, lovingly, Grandma Helen, the watcher of the world. I closed the album. My hands trembled. "Do you like it?" she asked. "I love it," I said. And I meant it. Because what she had given me wasn't just memories. It was proof that I had been seen, that I had mattered. That night, after she left, I stood at the window again. The chair was still beside it, but I didn't sit. I looked out, saw the tree, now budding with the earliest hints of spring, saw the sidewalk, clean and bright, saw the house across the street with its porch light flickering. Then I took a breath and reached for the curtain. My fingers didn't shake. I didn't hesitate. I pulled the curtain closed, not in sadness, not in surrender, but in peace, because the window had done its job. It had held my hopes, my grief, my love. It had let the world in, and it had let me out. But now it was time to let it rest and to step fully into the life that remained. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table instead. The light was softer there, gentler. Daniel came by after school. Sophie joined an hour later. We played cards, laughed, ate cookies that were slightly burnt. I told them a story about Michael they hadn't heard before, the one about the lost puppy and the borrowed bicycle, and the day he came home covered in mud with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. They listened like it was gold. And in their laughter, I heard Michael again, not as a ghost, but as something alive, something passed down, something held. As the sun set, Daniel walked to the living room. "Hey," he called out, "did you close the curtain?" "I did," I replied. He looked surprised, and then he smiled. "It was time," he said. I nodded. Yes, it was. That night, I sat at the foot of my bed with the photo album in my lap. I ran my fingers over each image, let the memories come and go, felt no pain, only gratitude. Because this life, this quiet, simple, long life, had been filled with love, even in the waiting, even in the silence, especially there. I wrote one last letter, not to Michael, not to Sophie, to myself. Dear Helen, you waited with grace. You loved without knowing if it would ever return. You sat beside a window for 20 years and believed. And in the end, love found its way home. You can rest now. You can live now. With all my love, you. I folded the letter, placed it inside the photo album, closed the cover, turned off the light, and let the night come in, not as something to fear, but as something earned. A reward, a closing. That wasn't an ending, but a beginning.